He built an empire worth $40 billion, then walked away. 5 years later, an anonymous email told him everything he trusted had been a lie. What happened next, no one in that glass tower saw coming. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you handed everything to, stay until the end. This story is for you. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The email arrived at 2:14 in the morning. Ethan Carter almost didn't see it. He'd been awake anyway, the way he usually was at that hour. Not from insomnia exactly, but from the particular kind of restlessness that settles into a person who has stopped giving their days enough weight to make them tired. He was sitting at the kitchen table in the small house he rented outside of Portland, a mug of cold coffee beside him, a half-finished sketch of a wind turbine blade on the paper in front of him. Old habit. He still drew them sometimes without meaning to, the way some people doodle faces. His laptop was open. He wasn't really looking at it. Then the notification light blinked, and something made him glance over. The sender field was blank. Not anonymous in the way spam is anonymous, blank, like someone had deliberately stripped it. The subject line read, "They're selling it, all of it. You need to see this." He stared at that line for a long moment. Then he pulled the laptop closer. He read the email once. Then he read it again, more slowly, his finger tracing the screen like he was checking whether the words were actually there. Attached were 7 documents. He opened them one by one, and with each file, the cold in the kitchen seemed to get heavier. Balance sheets, internal memos, a draft acquisition proposal addressed to a private equity consortium he'd never heard of, meeting minutes from a board session that wasn't listed anywhere in the official records. By the time he reached the last document, his coffee had gone completely cold, and the sketch in front of him had a deep crease running through it where his forearm had been pressing down. He closed the laptop, opened it again, closed it. Then he got up, walked down the short hallway to the bedroom at the end, and pushed open the door quietly. His daughter was asleep on her side, one arm wrapped around the stuffed bear she'd named Gerald, her breathing slow and even. She was 7 years old. She had her mother's nose and his stubborn jaw, and she talked too much and asked too many questions and had recently decided that the correct response to being told it was bedtime was a 20-minute negotiation. He stood in the doorway for a while just watching her breathe. Then he walked back to the kitchen, sat down, and opened the laptop again. He had a lot of thinking to do. His name, the full version, Ethan James Carter, used to appear in business magazines and conference programs and the occasional newspaper headline. Visionary. That was the word they reached for most often. He'd hated it even when it was meant as a compliment, because visionary implied a person who saw things others couldn't, and the truth was simpler and less flattering than that. He'd just been angry enough about the right problem at the right time, and he'd refused to stop working. The company was called Luminos Energy. He'd founded it at 24, in a rented workspace above a Vietnamese restaurant in San Francisco, with a whiteboard, a laptop, and a man named Daniel Reyes who was his closest friend and the only other person he knew who was both brilliant enough and reckless enough to attempt what they were attempting. The core idea was elegant in the way that only the most difficult ideas managed to be elegant. A new generation of distributed clean energy infrastructure that could operate in places traditional grids couldn't reach, scalable from a single rural community to an entire metropolitan region, built around a proprietary storage and transmission technology that Daniel had theorized and Ethan had figured out how to actually build. They worked for 3 years before they had anything worth showing anyone. Those 3 years were not the romantic montage that startup mythology likes to construct. They were grinding and exhausting and frequently humiliating. They ran out of money twice. They lost 2 key engineers to better-paying jobs. There was a period of 4 months when Ethan was sleeping on a cot in the workspace because he couldn't afford the rent on his apartment and the operational costs of the lab at the same time. And he had told no one because there was no one to tell. His parents were gone. He had few friends who weren't already inside Luminos. He ate whatever was cheap and kept his head down. What carried him through those years, more than ambition or stubbornness, was Daniel. Daniel Reyes was the kind of person who made everything feel slightly more possible than it was, not because he was blindly optimistic, but because he was so genuinely, specifically excited about the work itself that his excitement was contagious. He'd call Ethan at midnight to talk through a calculation he'd been stuck on for days. And there would be something in his voice, some vibrating frequency of barely contained energy that would make Ethan sit up and reach for a pen. They argued constantly. They disagreed about methodology and strategy and money and risk. But underneath every argument was a shared understanding of what they were trying to do and why it mattered, and that understanding made disagreement feel productive rather than threatening. By year 4, they had something. By year 6, Luminos was operational. By year 8, it was in 12 countries. By year 9, Daniel was dead. A road accident. That was what the official report called it, in the way that official reports tend to reduce catastrophic things to their most clinical description. Daniel had been driving back from a site visit in Nevada, a stretch of highway he'd driven a dozen times before. A truck crossed the center line at 3 in the afternoon. Daniel died at the scene. He was 31 years old. Ethan had been in Tokyo when it happened. He flew home immediately, and the flight was the longest 9 hours of his life. And somewhere over the Pacific, he made a decision that he didn't fully understand at the time. He would keep Luminos running. He would see it through. He owed Daniel that much. But something fundamental had shifted. The company had always been theirs, his and Daniel's, a shared project, a shared argument, a shared dream. Without Daniel, it was just a company, a large, successful, important company, but a company nonetheless. The animating thing was gone. He spent a year trying to manufacture the old energy. He showed up and he worked and he made decisions and he moved the company forward, but there was a flatness to it that he couldn't shake. He was going through motions that used to mean something and now just meant themselves. And then there was Sophie. Sophie's mother was a woman named Claire, whom Ethan had been with for 2 years, never married, perpetually planning to become more serious about it, running out of time to do so. Claire had died of an aggressive cancer when Sophie was not quite 2 years old. Ethan had been her father in the scattered, part-time way of a man who worked 80 hours a week and told himself that providing financially was the same as providing. When Claire died, Sophie became his entirely, and the adjustment had been enormous and immediate and had knocked loose every comfortable assumption he'd built his life around. He couldn't be the founder of a global company and a real father to a toddler who needed him present and consistent and sober in his attention. He'd tried for a year. He'd failed at both, adequately enough that from the outside it probably looked like he was succeeding at one. But he knew the truth. So he made the decision that most people who heard about it couldn't quite believe. He stepped back. He didn't sell his shares. He retained his founder equity and a dormant seat structure that existed in the original incorporation documents, a clause that Daniel had insisted on, half as a joke, about founder override authority that could be invoked if the company's core mission was ever materially threatened. Ethan had never expected to need it. He'd left it in the documents the way you leave emergency provisions in a bag you expect never to open. He appointed 2 people he trusted, Marcus Webb as chairman, a man who had been with Luminos since the early days, steady and experienced and deeply familiar with the company's values, and Victoria Hale as CEO, an executive he had recruited 2 years before his departure. Brilliant, strategic, relentless, committed, or so he had believed, to everything Luminos stood for. He moved to Portland with Sophie. He found a house. He enrolled her in school. He started drawing turbine blades on paper at 2 in the morning and telling himself it was therapy. And for 5 years, he had been wrong about Victoria Hale. The morning after the email, he called the number he had for Marcus Webb. It was disconnected. He tried again. Same result. He sat with that for a moment, then opened his laptop and searched Marcus's name. The first result was a Portland Business Journal piece from 14 months ago. Luminos Energy Chairman Marcus Webb retires amid health concerns. The article was brief and vague in the way that articles about internal corporate reshuffles tend to be vague. No direct quote from Marcus. A statement from the communications team wishing him well. Ethan hadn't known. He hadn't been paying attention. He pulled up Luminos's current executive page. The faces there were mostly unfamiliar to him. Victoria Hale's photograph looked back at him from the top of the page. The same sharp, composed expression he remembered, though something in it now read differently to him than it had before. Underneath her photo, Chief Executive Officer, 5 years in role. Revenue growth of 340% under her leadership. He spent 3 hours reading everything he could find. Press releases, financial filings, analyst reports. A tech industry newsletter piece from 4 months ago that described Luminos as an acquisition target worth watching. An item in a private equity trade publication mentioning preliminary discussions between unnamed parties regarding a strategic transaction in the clean energy sector. Nothing confirmed what the anonymous email had told him, but nothing contradicted it either. He closed the laptop and sat back. The house was quiet. Sophie was at school. The refrigerator hummed. Outside the window, a gray Portland morning was doing what gray Portland mornings do, which is mostly persist. He thought about calling a lawyer. He thought about calling the board directly. He thought about hiring an investigator. He didn't do any of those things. What he did instead was go to his closet and find the old gray suit. He'd bought it 11 years ago, early in the Luminos years, when he still thought that presenting himself professionally for investor meetings required a suit rather than the clean jeans and button-down that he'd eventually settled into. The suit was nothing remarkable. Mid-range, slightly too boxy for his frame, even when he'd bought it, now a full decade out of fashion. He'd kept it for no reason he could name, the way people keep things that were once important enough to purchase but never quite important enough to wear. He tried it on in front of the bathroom mirror. It fit him differently now than it had then. He was leaner, the years of irregular eating habits and physical restlessness having taken whatever softness a man in his 20s carries. The jacket hung a little wrong. The tie he found in the same box was a dark navy with a faint pattern he couldn't quite identify. He looked, he thought, exactly like a man who had once had a better suit. He thought about Sophie. She had a babysitter, Mrs. Chen from next door, who adored her and charged $12 an hour and made her eat vegetables, all of which Ethan was grateful for. He would tell Mrs. Chen he had business in the city. He would be back by evening. He would not tell Sophie anything because he did not yet know what there was to tell. He wrote a note, left it on the kitchen table. Back by 6. Good day at school, okay? He drew a small star next to the question mark, which was their thing, a symbol that had developed between them the way these symbols do, without deliberate invention, just through repetition and familiarity. Then he got in his car and drove towards Seattle. Luminos Energy's global headquarters occupied the top 11 floors of a glass tower in downtown Seattle that the company had moved into 3 years after Ethan's departure. He had seen photographs. He had never been inside. The building was exactly what he'd always resisted, the kind of architecture that announces importance rather than demonstrating it. All reflective surfaces and imposing proportions designed to make visitors feel appropriately small. He stood on the sidewalk across the street for several minutes, looking at it. The Luminos logo was on the front, his logo, the one he and Daniel had sketched on a napkin during their second year, the stylized sun and circuit motif that had seemed perfect at the time and embarrassingly earnest later and had then circled back around to seeming right again. He felt something looking at it that he didn't have an immediate word for. Not nostalgia, something closer to grief. He crossed the street and walked through the main entrance. The lobby was all polished stone and recessed lighting and the kind of artfully sparse vegetation that signals premium real estate. A reception desk occupied the center of the space, staffed by 2 people who had the practiced alertness of people paid to assess quickly. Ethan approached the desk. "Good morning," the receptionist said. Her name tag read Jamie. She was looking at him with professional neutrality, pleasant but evaluating, running the quick calculation that reception staff run when an unfamiliar person in an ordinary suit walks in without an appointment. "How can I help you?" "I'm here about the posted engineering position," Ethan said, "the senior systems analyst role." He had looked it up the night before, on the company's jobs page. There was, in fact, a senior systems analyst posting. Jamie's expression shifted very slightly. "Do you have an appointment?" "I don't. I was hoping to speak with someone in HR or drop off my materials. I understand it's a long shot without an appointment." She looked at him for a moment, and he could see her processing him. The suit, the age, the lack of appointment, the absence of whatever markers she associated with people who belonged in this building. "I can let you leave your resume," she said, "but I'm not able to guarantee anyone will." "That's completely fine," he said. I understand. She gave him a form. He filled it out with a name that was technically his, E. Carter, and an address in Portland, and a phone number that was 1 digit off from his real number. He handed her the form and a folder containing a resume he'd put together the previous night, listing his actual qualifications stripped of all context that would identify him, describing 5 years of independent research and consulting work. "We'll be in touch," Jamie said, in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. "Of course," Ethan said. "Thank you for your time." He turned from the desk and looked around the lobby like a man orienting himself, which he was. A group of 3 employees were standing near the elevator bank, not quite arguing, but having the kind of low-voiced conversation that involves suppressed disagreement. 2 more were crossing toward the exit, their conversation carrying enough words that Ethan caught fragments, the quarterly numbers, and before Victoria decides, and something else that was swallowed by the ambient noise. He found an armchair near a planter in the far corner of the lobby, the kind of chair that's there for visitors waiting for escorts, technically permissible, functionally invisible, and sat down. He had a paperback in the inside pocket of his jacket. He took it out and opened it and began from behind it to watch. He sat in that chair for most of the morning. What he saw, in the granular, unremarkable way that you see things when you're paying careful attention to them rather than moving through them. The Luminos that existed now had very little in common with the Luminos he had built. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not a literal absence of sound. The building was active, people moving, conversations happening, but a communicative silence, a quality of people saying less than they knew in each other's presence. He watched 2 employees arrive at the elevator together and ride it from lobby to wherever they were going without exchanging a single word, despite clearly knowing each other. He watched a young woman approach the receptionist desk with a question, get a short answer, leave looking slightly deflated. He watched a pair of executives cross the lobby without acknowledging a junior employee who attempted eye contact. In the old Luminos, the one he'd built, the noise had been constant. Not always comfortable, not always polite, but constant. People interrupting each other in hallways, arguments that spilled out of meeting rooms, an engineer from the power systems team cornering the head of procurement in the break room to complain about component specs. All the productive, uncomfortable, necessary friction of people who actually cared what happened. This felt like a company that had learned to perform itself rather than be itself. Around 11, a man in an expensive suit walked through the lobby with the kind of momentum that indicates someone exercising authority. Not in a hurry exactly, but moving through space in a way that expects other bodies to accommodate. 2 people visibly altered their paths to avoid crossing him. He went to the elevator, pressed the button, and stood there looking at his phone with the complete attention of a man who is determined he will never be caught looking at nothing. Ethan watched him go up. At 11:30, a young woman who looked like she was maybe 26 sat down across the lobby in one of the other waiting chairs, opened a laptop, and began working on something with a concentrated, slightly hunched focus. She was wearing an ordinary ID badge, not executive level, the kind that had a colored stripe indicating department. From what he could see at the distance, it was the stripe for research and development. She had a cup of coffee next to her and kept reaching for it without looking at it, and then seeming surprised when it was empty. He didn't speak to her then, but he noticed her. That the HR meeting happened by accident, or what presented itself as an accident but was actually the result of Ethan positioning himself near the elevator banks at lunchtime when traffic was highest. He was standing looking at a piece of wall art, Luminos's published sustainability targets in graphic form, something he didn't remember commissioning but which bore his original language closely enough to make him feel a hollow pride, when a woman in a blazer stopped next to him. "You're the 11 o'clock walk-in," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "E. Carter," he said, and offered his hand. "I know it was presumptuous coming in without an appointment." The woman, her badge said Renata Flores, Human Resources, shook it with the evaluating firmness of someone who shakes a lot of hands. "We get walk-ins sometimes, usually younger." She was looking at him the way HR people look at candidates, efficiently, clinically, with practiced neutrality. "I've been consulting independently for a few years," Ethan said. "I'm at a point where I want to be building something again, not just advising from outside." "Your background is systems engineering?" Energy infrastructure, primarily. Large-scale distributed systems. Renata's expression shifted slightly. The first sign of genuine rather than professional interest. That's specifically what the posting is. Most of the applications we've gotten have been general software. I saw the posting and it was a reasonable match, he said, which was technically true. She looked at him for a moment. I have 20 minutes before my next meeting. Let's get coffee. They sat in the lobby cafe, a small operation near the side wall that sold overpriced drinks to employees who didn't want to go outside. And Renata asked him the standard questions, which he answered with the standard answers in the particular way of a person who knows exactly what the questions are really asking. But what he was more interested in was what she wasn't saying. He had learned, in his years running Luminos, that the most valuable information about any organization is held in the language its employees use when they're not being formal. The words people avoid, the hesitations before certain topics, the way a person's affect changes slightly when they describe one part of the company versus another. When Renata talked about the engineering team, her voice carried a certain warmth. These were people she knew and respected. When she described the company's current projects, she was precise and professional. But when the conversation glanced near the executive level, which happened twice, briefly, something in her tightened in the specific way of a person who has made a decision not to express an opinion. "What's the culture like here?" he asked. Ordinary interview question, impossible to answer honestly in most interviews. Renata was quiet for a beat too long. "The company is in an ambitious phase right now," she said. "There's a lot of energy around strategic growth." "That sounds like a prepared answer," Ethan said, and let the smallest smile in. She looked at him. Then, unexpectedly, she almost laughed. "The culture depends a lot," she said carefully, "on what team you're on." "And the research division?" The hesitation was longer this time. "Research has historically been the heart of Luminos," she said. "It's been—" She stopped. Started again. "There's been some restructuring, different opinions about how to allocate resources." "Understood," Ethan said. He let it sit there. He left the meeting with a second interview scheduled, which had not been his intention, but which was, he realized, more useful. It gave him a reason to come back. On the drive home to Portland, he made 4 calls. The first was to a lawyer named Grace Tan, whom he had used for the original Luminos Incorporation and who he trusted enough to have kept in his phone for 5 years without calling. He told her he needed to understand the current status of his founder equity and the override clause in the incorporation documents. He told her to start immediately. She asked no unnecessary questions, which was exactly why he'd called her. The second call was to a man named Stuart Okafor, a forensic accountant he had worked with briefly during a funding dispute in Luminos's early days. He told Stuart he needed a financial picture of a company from public filings and any accessible secondary sources. He did not name Luminos. The third call was to the number on the anonymous email, which he already knew was dead and which was dead when he tried it, which told him something. The fourth call he didn't make. He had started to dial Marcus Webb's home number, the one he had from years ago, and then stopped. If Marcus had retired under pressure, and the more he thought about it, the more that health concerns explanation felt like the phrase companies use when the actual explanation is something else entirely. Then calling Marcus directly might warn someone who shouldn't be warned. He would have to be careful. He pulled into the driveway at 6:15, which was 15 minutes later than he'd said, and which he knew meant Sophie would have been watching the clock for at least 10 minutes. He got out of the car, and there she was, already in the doorway, wearing the yellow sweater she favored and the expression she wore when she was trying to look less anxious than she was. "You're late," she said. 15 minutes. 15 and a half. "I'll accept that correction." He came up the steps, and she moved to let him in. And then, because she was 7 and still did this without self-consciousness, she grabbed the back of his jacket as he passed and leaned into him briefly in the way that was not quite a hug, but was the thing she did instead of one when she was being dignified about her emotions. "Mrs. Chen made me eat asparagus," she said. "How was it?" "Fine," she said darkly. That's the worst part." He laughed, actually laughed, the first time he'd laughed all day, and it felt like releasing pressure from something that had been sealed. He made dinner, pasta, the one dish he could reliably produce without it being a disaster. And they ate at the kitchen table, and Sophie told him about a disagreement she'd had with a boy at school over the rules of a game, an account that grew more elaborate and detailed with each sentence until he was no longer entirely certain whether she was describing events accurately or constructing a narrative that positioned herself more favorably, and he didn't interrupt because it was the best thing he'd heard all day. Afterward, she did homework. He washed the dishes and stood at the sink looking out the window at the backyard. The anonymous email, the disconnected line, Marcus Webb's retirement, Victoria Hale's photograph at the top of the executive page, looking back at him with that composed certainty. He'd built Luminos from nothing. He'd spent 11 years watching it grow into something that actually mattered, not in the aspirational press release way that companies talk about mattering, but in the tangible way. Communities that had power because of Luminos's infrastructure, research that was genuinely pushing forward what was possible in clean energy, an organization that, for all its flaws, was doing real work. Daniel had died for it, in the oblique way that a person who defines their life around something can be said to have given their life to it. He had walked away and trusted people to protect it. And now he was standing at a sink in Portland, wearing the 15-year-old tie he'd untied in the car on the way home, with a second interview scheduled at his own company under a name that was technically his, but was designed to obscure who he actually was. He was not angry. That surprised him. He kept expecting anger to arrive, and instead what was there was something colder and more durable, a quality of fixed attention, like a lens that has been brought into focus. He dried his hands and went to help Sophie with her homework. He would need to know what was in those classified documents before the second interview. He would need to understand the full shape of what Victoria had built and what she was planning to sell. He would need to know who else was involved, who in the organization still had loyalty to what Luminos was supposed to be, and who had simply adapted to what it had become. He also needed to figure out what he was going to do about the young woman from the R&D department with the empty coffee cup, because something about her particular brand of tense, focused isolation in that lobby told him she was carrying a weight that wasn't ordinary work stress. He might be wrong. He was often wrong about people. But he'd been right about Daniel all those years ago in a coffee shop in San Francisco when a stranger had sat down uninvited and started talking about energy storage systems with the cadence of a person saying things they'd never had an audience for before. "Dad," Sophie called from the living room, "what's 11 times 9? 99, he said. "Are you sure?" "Check me." A pause. "You're right, that's annoying." He smiled in the empty kitchen. There was a lot left to do. The second interview was scheduled for a Tuesday. Ethan spent the 4 days between that first visit and the appointment doing the kind of work that doesn't look like work from the outside, sitting with documents, reading financials, making calls, filling legal pads with notes that he burned in the backyard fire pit each evening. Grace Tan called him back on the second day with the information he needed about the founder override clause. It was still active, still valid, still sitting in the original incorporation documents that Victoria Hale's legal team had apparently never examined closely enough to understand what it permitted. "It's unusual language," Grace told him. "Whoever drafted this was being very deliberate. It gives the founding equity holder, specifically you, the ability to invoke a full authority suspension of executive management if there's documented evidence of material breach of the company's founding charter. The board can challenge it after the fact, but the invocation itself is immediate." "How documented does the evidence need to be?" he asked. "Airtight," she said. "You'd need things that can't be explained away. Internal communications, financial records, something showing intent." He told her to stay available. Stuart Okafor's report arrived on the third day. It was 41 pages, dense and technical, and Ethan read it twice. What it showed, assembled from public filings and secondary sources, and the kind of careful inference that a good forensic accountant builds from available data, was a pattern. Over the past 2 years, Luminos's research division had been quietly defunded, not in any single dramatic move, but in the gradual, unremarkable way that organizations use when they want a thing to die without appearing to have killed it. Budget allocations reduced by small percentages each quarter. Key research roles reclassified or eliminated under restructuring language. Patent applications slowed. 3 long-term research partnerships with universities, partnerships that Ethan himself had negotiated, quietly allowed to lapse. Meanwhile, the company's public narrative had shifted entirely toward commercial deployment and revenue growth. The press releases talked about expansion into new markets. The investor communications emphasized profitability metrics. Everything that had made Luminos worth $40 billion, the genuine technological edge, the research pipeline that was 3 or 4 breakthroughs ahead of any competitor, was being quietly removed from the engine while the car kept driving. When you stripped away a company's research division, you stripped away its future. What remained was a present-tense asset that someone with the right connections could sell to a private equity firm, extract maximum value from in the short term, and walk away from before the consequences arrived. The anonymous documents had described the sale price in preliminary terms, somewhere between $11 and $13 billion. For a company whose real value, with its research assets intact, was closer to $45 billion. Someone was going to make $30 billion disappear, and several specific people were, apparently, going to get very wealthy from making it disappear. Ethan sat with that number for a long time. He drove to Seattle on Tuesday morning in the gray suit with a folder containing a slightly different resume than the first one. Same core information. One additional detail he'd added because he needed a reason to be in the building for longer than an interview. He'd listed a reference in the systems engineering world, a real person who had worked briefly with Luminos in its early years and who would not recognize the name E. Carter but would say accurate things about his qualifications if asked, because those qualifications were real. He parked 3 blocks from the building and walked. It was raining in the particular Seattle way, not a downpour, but a persistent mist that made everything slightly blurred at the edges. The lobby receptionist this time was someone different, a young man who processed him quickly and gave him a visitor badge and called upstairs without much curiosity. The badge said, "Visitor," in the way visitor badges always do, large and slightly humiliating, designed to communicate that the wearer has not yet earned the right to be here unremarked. Renata met him at the elevator and took him up to the 7th floor. The 7th floor was HR and administrative operations, which meant it had the particular quality of spaces designed to be neutral. Neutral carpet, neutral walls, neutral art, a temperature calibrated to no one in particular. He walked through it noting things without appearing to note them. The open plan section had about 30 people at workstations. Most of them were heads down. A few were talking. Nobody looked up when he passed. The interview itself was Renata and a man named Douglas Chen, who ran technical operations for the engineering team, mid-40s, careful, the kind of engineer who had gone into management without fully shedding the engineer's instinct to ask precise questions about specific things. Douglas was more interesting than Renata in some ways, because when he talked about the technical work he was genuinely engaged, but when the conversation moved toward strategy or leadership, his answers became short and correct in the way of a man who has learned to be careful about what he says in rooms he doesn't fully control. "Your background in distributed systems," Douglas said. "You've done this at scale, not theoretical?" "Built and managed infrastructure serving about 400,000 endpoints across 3 continents," Ethan said, which was true. Douglas looked at him. "That's a lot for an independent consultant." It was a different kind of role than it might look on paper. There was a pause that had weight to it. Douglas was processing something. "The posting is technically for a senior analyst," he said. "But what we're actually short on is someone who can look at what we've built and tell us where the gaps are, objectively." "From outside the existing assumptions," Ethan said. "Yes." Something loosened slightly in Douglas's expression. People inside a system get habituated to its logic. They stop seeing what doesn't fit. "I understand that problem well." They talked for another 40 minutes, and somewhere in the middle of it, Ethan recognized that Douglas Chen was a man who was frustrated. Not in a vocal, complaining way. The frustration was compressed, sitting behind his eyes, showing itself only in the small gaps between what he said and what he almost said. The research division defunding had affected his team. He wasn't going to say that directly, but it was there in the specific way he talked about resource constraints and in the precise, resigned neutrality with which he described the company's current strategic direction. Ethan filed that away. After the formal interview, Renata gave him the standard, "We'll be in touch by end of week," and walked him back toward the elevator. In the hallway outside the conference room, a cluster of people were standing with printed materials, waiting for the room to clear. Looked like a mid-level team meeting. Among them was the young woman from the lobby. She was holding a stack of papers against her chest, and she was looking at something on the wall behind them with the focused blankness of someone thinking hard about something that has nothing to do with their immediate surroundings. Her badge said Nora Lamb, R&D Systems. She looked up when they passed and made brief eye contact with Ethan, the instant of contact that happens in hallways, and then looked away. "You have a research team on this floor?" Ethan said to Renata, as casually as he could manage. "Research is on 11 and 12, Renata said. "Some of the team members come down for conference rooms when theirs are booked." Long walk for a meeting. Renata's answer was half a beat slower than it needed to be. "We have some space constraints since the last restructuring." He nodded and said nothing more about it. On the elevator down, he thought about Nora Lamb carrying her stack of papers to a borrowed conference room because the research division had run out of space. He thought about Douglas Chen's compressed frustration and his pointed question about seeing gaps from outside the existing assumptions. He thought about the 41 pages of Stuart Okafor's report and the 3 lapsed university partnerships and the quietly defunded research budget. The lobby came back into view as the elevator descended. Through the glass front wall, the Seattle mist was still doing what it had been doing. The building, seen from inside, felt less intimidating than it had from the sidewalk. That was often true of impressive things up close. They were still impressive, but they became specific rather than symbolic, and specific things had handles. He collected his visitor badge receipt at the front desk and went out through the revolving door. He made it half a block before he stopped and stood still for a moment on the wet sidewalk, people moving past him, and made a decision that he'd actually been making since he'd read that email at 2 in the morning but hadn't fully acknowledged until now. He was going back in. Not for a third interview. Through the door he'd already opened. But the callback came on Thursday. Renata's voice on the phone was professional and slightly warmer than it needed to be for a standard callback, which told him something. "We'd like to offer you the position on a provisional trial basis," she said. "Douglas Chen specifically requested we move forward. You'd start Monday if that works." "That works," Ethan said. He spent Thursday evening with Sophie, who was in the phase of being intensely interested in how bridges worked and wanted him to explain the engineering of suspension bridges, which he did, at a level of detail that ended with her saying, "Okay, but why does the cable have to be curved, specifically?" and him realizing she was actually asking a real question rather than just making conversation. "Because the shape distributes the load," he said. "If it were straight, all the weight would concentrate in one place and break it. The curve spreads the pressure so the whole thing can hold." She thought about that. "Is that why you bend sometimes, when things are heavy?" He looked at her. She was 7, but she had a way of saying things that landed at angles he didn't expect. "Something like that," he said. "Mrs. Chen says you seem stressed lately." "I have some work things." "Work things," she repeated, in the tone she'd started using when she felt an answer was technically true, but incomplete. "I'll tell you more when I know more," he said. She seemed to accept that, or at least to accept that it was what she was going to get for now. She went back to her bridge diagram. He sat beside her at the table, and the kitchen was quiet except for her pencil on paper, and he let himself be present for a few minutes without the weight of what he was walking into. He started at Luminos on Monday. The onboarding process was thorough in the administrative sense and essentially empty in any other. He sat through 3 hours of compliance training videos that had clearly been produced by a third-party vendor and contained no specific information about Luminos at all. He filled out forms. He was given a workstation in the open plan section of the 7th floor, an ID badge that now had his name and a colored stripe, a laptop that IT had pre-configured, and a brief tour of the floor by a young HR coordinator named Ben, who pointed out the coffee station, the bathrooms, the emergency exits, and the conference rooms, in that order of apparent priority. "Any questions?" Ben asked at the end. "Who should I go to if I need access to legacy technical documentation? Older system architecture records?" Ben blinked. "That would be... I'm not sure, actually. You'd want to ask Douglas." Got it, thanks. He spent the first 2 days doing what he'd been asked to do, reviewing current systems documentation, running gap analyses on the infrastructure architecture, producing the kind of competent technical work that would make Douglas Chen feel the hire had been justified. It was not difficult work. He could have done it in his sleep, and parts of it felt like that. The strange experience of analyzing a system that he had originally designed, like reading something you wrote long ago and recognizing your own patterns in it, while also seeing clearly where someone else had made changes. And someone had made changes, not improvements mostly, adjustments that served short-term efficiency at the expense of the long-term architecture he and Daniel had designed. In 3 specific places, the changes had created vulnerabilities in the system that nobody in the current engineering team seemed to have noticed or flagged. He noted them carefully in his analysis documents and said nothing about them in the team meetings he was invited to. On the 3rd day, he met Nora Lamb properly. She came to his workstation at 10 in the morning with the particular energy of someone who has been arguing with themselves about whether to do something and finally decided to do it. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which was immediately disarming. "You're the new systems analyst," she said. "E. Carter," he said. "Most people say Ethan." She set one of the cups on his desk. "Nora Lamb, research and development. I'm on 11. Long way down for coffee." "Our machine broke 3 weeks ago," she said, without particular heat. "Apparently it's not in the budget to replace it. I make the trip a few times a day. It's fine." She said it's fine the way people say things they have decided to be philosophical about, rather than things that are actually fine. He looked at her. "Thank you for the coffee." "I saw you in the interview hallway last week," she said. "I was curious what role they were filling." "Systems analyst." "Yes, I know. I looked it up." She was direct in a way that wasn't impolite, but didn't try to conceal what it was. "We've lost 4 senior engineers in the last year, 2 to other companies, 2 to the restructuring. I've been trying to figure out who they're replacing them with and why." And mostly they've been replacing technical people with project management roles, which is the company's way of saying we need fewer people who build things and more people who report on the building of things. She caught herself. "That was more than I meant to say to someone I just met." "I won't repeat it," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the evaluating attention of a person deciding something. "You looked at the legacy architecture documents," she said. "Ben mentioned it. Most people starting new don't ask for those in the first week." "Old habit." "From where?" He took a sip of the coffee. It was better than he'd expected from a lobby cafe. "I've worked on similar systems," he said. "You want to know how something got to where it is?" Nora was quiet for a moment. Outside the window behind his workstation, the Seattle skyline did its thing. Gray towers, gray sky, the particular flatness of a Pacific Northwest autumn morning. "The research division has been hemorrhaging for 2 years," she said finally, and her voice had changed slightly, the directness becoming something more careful. "Not dramatically, just steadily. Every quarter something disappears, a budget line, a program, a team member. It's designed to look like normal attrition." "But it doesn't feel like normal attrition," he said. "No." She held her cup in both hands. "I have 3 years of data showing where our research pipeline was trending. Before the restructuring, we were 18 months away from a breakthrough in second-generation storage technology that would have tripled our infrastructure efficiency. Then the program got reclassified as non-essential, and the team was dispersed." She said it evenly, factually, but under the fact was something she was keeping controlled. Ethan said, "Why are you telling me this?" It was a fair question, and she seemed to appreciate that he asked it directly. "Because you asked for the legacy documents," she said. "And because you've been here 3 days and you're already looking at things in a way that people who are just doing their jobs don't look at things." She paused. "And because I'm running out of people to talk to about it." He looked at her steadily. "What are you going to do with what you know?" The question landed on her. He watched her take it in. "I don't know yet," she said, which was honest. "I've been collecting data, documenting. I have records of the changes, the decisions, the timing of things. I've been trying to figure out if there's a pattern or if I'm constructing one because it feels like there should be." "Is there a pattern?" She met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "I'm sure of it. I just don't know who I can give it to." He nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else about it, and neither did she. She picked up her empty cup, said she had a meeting on 11, and left. He watched her go and then turned back to his screen. The third day at Luminos. He had a workstation, an ID badge, a cup of coffee that someone else had brought him, and now a name to attach to the anonymous email. He wasn't certain yet, but almost. The next week moved the way weeks inside organizations move, in the irregular rhythm of meetings and tasks and the accumulating texture of a workplace becoming familiar. He was learning the building from inside now, which was different from observing it from a lobby chair. He learned which elevators were slow, which conference rooms had faulty temperature control, where the informal clusters formed at lunchtime. He learned the social architecture, who deferred to whom, which names carried weight in conversations, which names produced that particular careful stillness that meant caution was being exercised. Victoria Hale's name produced that stillness most reliably. He had not seen her yet. She occupied the top floor, the executive suite on 22, which required a specific badge level to access, and which might as well have been a different building for how it was discussed. But her presence moved through the organization in the way that powerful people's presences do, carried in the form of decisions that arrived without explanation and directives that got passed down through layers until they reached the floor level stripped of all context, just the instruction with no rationale attached. He heard her name the most in the context of the quarterly review that was coming up in 2 weeks. Before Victoria sees the numbers, Victoria wants the deck restructured. Make sure it aligns with what Victoria's been telling the board. What struck him was not the authority. He'd been in organizations with strong central authority, had built one himself. It was the absence of any counterbalance. In the Luminos he'd built, the authority of any individual was always in tension with other voices, other perspectives, people willing to push back and be pushed back on. What he was hearing now described a company that had settled into a single alignment, like a compass needle finding north and refusing to move. That kind of alignment was efficient right up until the moment it broke. Douglas Chen stopped by his workstation on Thursday of the second week to review his gap analysis report, which Ethan had completed and which was considerably more detailed than Douglas had expected. "This is thorough," Douglas said, flipping through it. "I found some things worth flagging." "The 3 system vulnerabilities?" "Yes, but also the pattern in how the updates were made. Whoever authorized them was prioritizing short-term performance metrics. The long-term structural logic of the architecture was treated as secondary." Douglas was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the report, but he was thinking about something else. "How long have you been working in this field?" he said. "A long time," Ethan said. Douglas looked up, and for just a moment, the fraction of a second before professional neutrality reestablished itself, his expression held something that was almost recognition. Not of a person, but of something in the way Ethan had described the architecture, some specific language, some pattern of thought. Then he closed the report. "I'll pass this to the team," he said. "Good work." He left without saying anything more, and Ethan sat at his desk afterward thinking about that fraction of a second. On Friday afternoon, Nora found him again at the coffee station. They'd had 2 other brief conversations during the week, nothing long, but with the quality of conversations that are building toward something. "The quarterly review meeting," she said without preamble. 2 weeks from Monday. "I've heard it mentioned. It's not a standard review. There are people coming in from outside the company, not introduced, not on any official invite list. I overheard part of a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear." She kept her voice low, not theatrical low, but genuinely quiet. "It's an acquisition discussion. They're presenting the company's assets in a format that isn't designed for internal review." "How do you know what it's designed for?" "Because the format matches the document template in an acquisition proposal I found attached to an internal server I still have access to from a previous role." She looked at him steadily. "A role I had before the restructuring removed my clearance for that server, but they missed a subdirectory." Ethan poured his coffee, took a sip, set the cup down. "Nora," he said carefully, "what exactly did you find in that subdirectory?" She didn't answer right away. The coffee station was empty except for the two of them, but she glanced toward the open-plan floor the way anyone would who has learned to be careful about where conversations happen. "Enough," she finally said. "I found enough." He looked at her. The compressed tension in her, the thing he'd noticed from the first day in the lobby, made a different kind of sense to him now. She'd been carrying this for a while. Not just the knowledge, but the particular loneliness of knowing something you can't easily tell anyone. The weight of it sitting behind every ordinary interaction. "Are they safe?" he said. "The documents. I have copies, in 3 places." He nodded once. Then he said, "Don't do anything with them yet. Not yet. Can you wait 2 weeks?" She looked at him with the particular expression of a person deciding whether to trust something they can't fully explain. "Why 2 weeks?" "Because I need to be in that room," he said. "The quarterly review. I need to be in that room." She stared at him. "You're a junior systems analyst who's been here 11 days. "Yes," he said. "You can't get into that meeting." "I know." She was quiet, reading him. Not his face exactly, but whatever it is that people read when they're trying to understand whether someone is who they're presenting themselves as. He met her eyes and let her look. 2 weeks, she said finally, not agreeing exactly, but not refusing. He picked up his coffee and went back to his workstation. Outside, the gray Seattle afternoon continued. The building hummed with its own internal logic, its floors of people doing their work, its executives on the 22nd floor making their plans. The logo on the building's face, his logo, Daniel's logo, caught the flat afternoon light and held it. 11 days down, 2 weeks to go. He had a lot left to do, and none of it was going to be clean or straightforward, and some of it he was probably going to get wrong. He opened his gap analysis document and started writing. The 2 weeks did not move cleanly. Ethan had expected friction, the ordinary resistance of trying to position yourself inside an organization's logic without being fully inside it. But the specific shape of the friction surprised him. It was not dramatic. It was the 1,000 small things, a meeting he needed to be in that required a clearance level his badge didn't carry, a conversation that stopped when he approached, a document request that went unanswered for 4 days before coming back redacted to the point of uselessness. The building had its immune system, and it was working. He adapted. He had always been better at adapting than he gave himself credit for. Douglas Chen became the most useful relationship. Not because Douglas was an ally in any declared sense. The man was careful, professionally armored in the way of someone who had watched colleagues make the mistake of expressing opinions in the wrong rooms, but because he respected competent work, and Ethan was producing it. 3 days after the gap analysis report, Douglas gave him access to a secondary documentation archive that contained records going back 8 years, which was 3 years further than Ethan had hoped for. He spent 2 evenings in the office going through those records, staying late in the way that new employees sometimes do, which nobody questions because it reads as eagerness. What he found confirmed and extended Stuart Okafor's picture. The pattern was meticulous. Whoever had designed the defunding of the research division had done it with the patience of someone who understood that visible destruction draws attention, but slow withdrawal does not. Budget lines reduced by 6% one quarter, 8% the next, reclassified entirely by the third. A program that had been central to Luminos's second-generation storage work had not been canceled. It had been restructured, renamed, transferred to a different department, its key personnel shuffled, until the program existed on paper but functioned as nothing. The signatures on the authorization documents were primarily Victoria Hale's, but not exclusively. There were 2 others, a CFO named Raymond Price and a board member named Gerald Foss, whose name Ethan recognized from the acquisition consortium documents in the anonymous email. The triangle was clear enough once you could see all 3 points. He photographed everything with his phone, transferred nothing to the work laptop, and stayed careful. Nora Lamb had gone quiet. Not hostile quiet, just contained. She had pulled back slightly after their conversation at the coffee station, and he understood why. She had said more than she intended to, and she was reassessing. He gave her space and didn't push, which was the right move, because on the 9th day, she sent him a message through the internal system. The subdirectory I mentioned. I counted 17 separate documents. He replied, "Keep them where they are. Don't move them." She didn't respond, but the read receipt appeared immediately. Getting into the quarterly review meeting required the kind of lateral thinking that Ethan was not naturally inclined toward, but had learned out of necessity during the years of building Luminos. The years when they couldn't afford to approach problems directly because the direct approaches were all blocked, so they went around. He needed to be in that room. The meeting was on the 22nd floor, the executive suite, and his badge would not take him there. The official attendee list, which he'd managed to glimpse on Douglas's screen during a brief exchange, contained no entry for a junior systems analyst. What it did contain was a reference to a technical presentation on infrastructure performance metrics to be delivered by the engineering team. Douglas Chen's name was attached to it. Ethan went to Douglas on the Thursday before the Monday meeting. "The infrastructure performance section of the quarterly review," he said. "I've been in the legacy records for 2 weeks. I know where the bodies are buried in the architecture, so to speak." Douglas looked at him across the desk. "That section is covered." "I know. I'm not trying to step on anything." He set a single printed page on the desk, a condensed version of the gap analysis, 5 key findings highlighted, each one tied to a specific metric that would be relevant to any presentation about infrastructure performance. 3 of these findings directly affect how the numbers look in that presentation. If they're not contextualized correctly, someone could draw wrong conclusions. Douglas picked up the page. He read it. He was quiet for long enough that Ethan started to think the answer was going to be no. "You're asking to come into the meeting," Douglas said, "as technical support. I stay in the back. If you need to reference the findings, I'm there to answer technical questions. If you don't need me, I was never visible." Douglas set the page down. He looked out his window for a moment, then back. "The meeting is not a standard review," he said. "I know." Another pause. "How much do you know?" "Enough to understand why the technical presentation matters," Ethan said, "and enough to want to be in the room." Douglas Chen was not a stupid man. He was sitting across the desk from someone who had been at the company for less than 3 weeks, asking to attend a restricted executive meeting and explaining it in terms that were technically reasonable but carried some other weight that Douglas could feel without being able to name precisely. He was making a calculation, and Ethan could see him making it. "You'll need an escort badge for 22, Douglas said finally. "I'll handle that. You come in as part of my team. You sit in the back. You speak only if I ask you directly." "Understood." "And Carter," Douglas said as Ethan stood to leave. He waited until Ethan turned around. "Whatever you're actually here for, I hope you know what you're doing." Ethan held his gaze. "So do I," he said, which was honest. He drove back to Portland that Friday evening and told Sophie he needed to talk to her about something. She was at the kitchen table building something out of rubber bands and paper clips, a structure whose purpose was not immediately apparent. She looked up with the attention she gave things she considered worth her time. "I'm going to be doing something next week that's important," he said. "It might mean some changes in our life and how things are for a while." "Changes like what?" "I don't know exactly yet, but I want you to know it's coming and I don't want it to be a surprise." Sophie considered this with the gravity of someone being given information they understand is incomplete but meaningful. "Is it about work?" she said. "Yes." "The work you're doing in Seattle?" "Yes." "Is it the thing that's been making you stressed?" "It's connected to that." She picked up a paperclip and added it to her structure with precision. "Are you going to be okay?" The directness of it caught him off guard, the way her directness often did. He had spent 2 weeks absorbing the Luminos building and its politics and its architecture of betrayal, and his daughter had cut through all of it with 5 words. "I think so," he said. "I'm working on it." She nodded, considering, and went back to her construction. "Okay," she said. "Tell me when you know more." He sat with her for a while, not talking, just being present in the kitchen while she built her inexplicable structure and the evening settled around them. Monday arrived the way important days arrive when you've been anticipating them. Simultaneously, too fast and too slow, the preceding weekend feeling both compressed and interminable. He drove to Seattle in the dark at 5:30 in the morning, got to the building at 8, and found Douglas already at his desk looking like a man who had not slept particularly well. "Ready?" Douglas said. Yes. They went up to 22 at 9:50 for a 10 o'clock meeting. The elevator required Douglas's badge at a separate reader, and the doors opened onto a floor that was architecturally different from everything below. Quieter, colder, more deliberately impressive. The hallway carpet was a different grade. The art on the walls was real rather than reproduced. The conference room they were directed to was large enough to seat 30, with floor-to-ceiling windows looking over the city and a table made of some dark polished wood that caught the light in the particular way of things that cost more than they needed to. Ethan walked in behind Douglas and went directly to the back wall, which had a row of chairs along it for support staff and secondary attendees, and he sat down and opened the folder he'd brought and looked at nothing in particular with the practiced blankness of a man who is exactly as unimportant as the room has decided he is. People filed in. He noted faces against names he'd researched. Raymond Price, the CFO. Compact, well-dressed, the specific kind of groomed that signals deliberate attention to appearance. Gerald Foss, the board member. Older, maybe 60, with the relaxed authority of a person who has been important long enough that they no longer feel the need to perform it. Two people he didn't recognize but whose visitor badges identified them as external, the consortium representatives, he assumed, though their badges listed no affiliation. A lawyer he identified from her posture and the way she arranged her materials. Then Victoria Hale. He had looked at her photograph many times over the past 2 weeks. The photograph had not prepared him for the specific quality of her presence in a room, which was not what he would have predicted. She was not loud. She did not perform authority with volume or gesture. She came in and sat at the head of the table, and the room arranged itself around her in the way that rooms arrange themselves around a person who has made it consistently clear, over years, that their attention is the thing that matters. She was 30 years old. He had known that from the records. In person, she read simultaneously younger and older. The face still had the quality of someone who had not been at this long enough to be fully habituated to it, but the eyes had the efficiency of someone who had stopped wasting attention on things that didn't serve immediate purposes. She glanced around the table with the practiced sweep of someone taking attendance, and when her eyes passed over the back wall where Ethan was sitting, they moved on without pausing. He had expected to feel something in that moment. Some complex thing. Anger, grief, the weight of 5 years of misplaced trust. What he actually felt was clarity, which was simpler and colder and more useful. The meeting began. The first 40 minutes were the standard apparatus of a quarterly review, the performance metrics, the market position analysis, the revenue figures that had grown impressively under Victoria's tenure. Douglas presented the infrastructure section. He did it well, and he referenced Ethan's gap analysis findings in the way he'd said he would, and nobody in the room looked at the back wall even once. Then the tone shifted. Victoria said, "Gerald, I think we can move to the strategic discussion." Foss nodded and began speaking in the particular language of a man who is conducting a transaction and has decided to be direct about it among people he considers peers. The external visitors, the consortium representatives, were introduced finally as being from a private investment group called Meridian Capital. The acquisition framework, the valuation structure, the timeline. Ethan listened to numbers being assigned to the thing he'd built. $11.4 billion. Initial offer, with a performance incentive structure that could reach 13. Raymond Price walked through the financial architecture with the efficient precision of someone who had prepared this presentation many times in private. The research division's assets were listed as a separate line item, described as non-core holdings to be evaluated independently post-acquisition, which was the language of a person who intended to sell them separately or simply dissolve them. The lawyer was taking notes. Victoria said, almost incidentally, "The research division has been restructured into a posture that doesn't create complications for the transaction. The core team has been reduced to a point where the remaining personnel can be absorbed or released without triggering material retention clauses." Ethan kept his face completely still. One of the Meridian representatives, a thin man who had said almost nothing to this point, said, "The founder equity position, Carter's stake. Have you resolved that?" There was a very short silence. Then Victoria said, "Ethan Carter has had no operational involvement with this company for 5 years. The founder equity is a legacy structure. Our legal team has reviewed the applicable provisions and determined they don't create obstacles. The thin man said, "And the override clause?" "Dormant," Victoria said, "and unenforceable in any practical sense given his absence from operations. We have counsel's opinion on that." Ethan set his folder on the chair beside him. He stood up. The movement was quiet and unremarkable, but it drew eyes from the nearest people, and then more eyes. And then Victoria Hale looked toward the back wall for the first time since the meeting had begun. He walked to the table. Someone said, "Excuse me," and he thought it was the lawyer. Douglas Chen said nothing. He was watching from his seat with an expression that had gone completely unreadable. "Security should—" someone else started. "One moment," Ethan said. He placed the sealed envelope on the table first, the one Grace Tan had prepared containing the notarized founder credential documentation, his equity verification, and the certified copy of the override clause. Then he opened his folder and laid out 17 printed documents in a row along the table's edge, methodically, without hurry. Victoria Hale had not moved. She was watching him with an expression that was trying to recalibrate and not quite getting there fast enough. "Who are you?" she said, and her voice was controlled but with something running under the control. "My name is Ethan Carter," he said. "I built this company." The room had gone the particular kind of quiet that rooms go when something is shifted in a way that cannot be unshifted. Gerald Foss's face had changed color. Raymond Price was very still. The Meridian representatives were exchanging a look that contained about 15 years of legal instinct compressed into 2 seconds. "This is not—" Victoria started. "I've been in this building for 3 weeks," Ethan said. He was not raising his voice. There was no need to raise his voice. "I've been in the archive. I've been in the systems documentation. I've been sitting in the back of this room for the last 40 minutes. He touched the first document in the row. "This is the authorization record for the defunding of the second-generation storage research program. Your signature, your authorization code, March of last year." He moved to the next document. "This is the acquisition proposal draft sent to Meridian Capital's predecessor entity 14 months ago, before any board notification, before any shareholder disclosure." He moved down the row. "This is the internal communication between yourself, Raymond Price, and Gerald Foss discussing the methodology for the research division reduction in terms that describe it explicitly as preparation for a transaction." He stopped. "I have 11 more." The silence had a texture now. Someone near the door was on their phone. Security, he assumed, and that was fine. Let them come. Victoria Hale stood up. When she stood, the room felt it. The shift in the arrangement of authority, the CEO coming to her full height, the composure reasserting itself. She was not panicking. She was recalculating, and she was fast. He could see it happening in real time, and he had a moment of recognizing exactly why he'd hired her in the first place, which made what he was doing both easier and harder simultaneously. "Ethan," she said. She had switched to the first name, which was deliberate, reclaiming intimacy, recasting the dynamic from adversarial to personal. "You've been out of this company for 5 years. You left. Whatever you think you found in those documents—" "I don't think I've found anything," he said. "I know what I've found. The documents say what they say. They require context. There are strategic considerations here that you're not positioned to—" $30 billion, he said. She stopped. "The difference between what this company is actually worth and what you're selling it for," he said. "That's the context I'm positioned to understand." Gerald Foss said, with the thin authority of a man who is used to authority being sufficient, "This is completely irregular. Security—" "Security can come in," Ethan said, "and then I'll have more witnesses in the room for what happens next." He reached into the inside pocket of the gray suit jacket and removed a single folded document, the one Grace had called the most carefully drafted thing she'd produced in 20 years of corporate law. He unfolded it and placed it at the center of the table. "This is the invocation of the founder override clause," he said. "Certified, witnessed, legally valid under the original incorporation documents that no one in this room has amended because they didn't know to look at them." He looked at Victoria directly for the first time since he'd stood up. "Effective upon placement on the table before active executives of the company, which is now." Victoria looked at the document. She looked at it for a long moment, and in that moment, Ethan saw something cross her face that wasn't anger and wasn't fear exactly, but was the specific expression of a person recognizing that the ground beneath a plan they have spent years constructing has shifted in a way that cannot be reversed. Then she looked up at him, and for the first time the composure had a crack in it. Not wide, not dramatic, but real. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said, and her voice had a different quality now, lower, the performance stripped back. This company needed to evolve. The research division was bleeding resources for diminishing returns. The acquisition was the right strategic... It was the right strategic move for you, Ethan said, and for Raymond and for Gerald and for the consulting fees and the equity positions and the arrangements with Meridian that are in document number 14. He paused. It was not the right strategic move for the 400 engineers who work here, or the communities that depend on this infrastructure, or Daniel Reyes, who spent the last years of his life building the research division that you spent 2 years quietly gutting. The name landed in the room. He had not intended to say it. It came out of somewhere he hadn't planned for, and once it was in the air, he felt the rawness of it. Victoria said nothing. The door opened. 2 security officers came in, young, professional, confused in the specific way of people called to an emergency they have not been briefed on. Ethan looked at them. "I'm Ethan Carter," he said. "I'm the founder of this company and the holder of the founder equity position. The document in the center of that table invokes my authority under the original incorporation charter. You can verify that with legal, which will take approximately 10 minutes. He turned back to the room. "I'd suggest we all stay seated until that verification is complete." Douglas Chen made a sound from across the table that might have been a short, involuntary laugh immediately suppressed. The security officers looked at Victoria. Victoria was looking at the document in the center of the table with the expression of someone counting the distance between where they are and where the exits are, and finding it insufficient. Raymond Price said, in a voice that had gone very quiet, "Gerald, we need legal in here right now." Foss was already on his phone. The Meridian representatives had the stillness of people who have attended enough transactions to recognize the moment when a transaction has gone sideways, and who have already, in some internal accounting, begun revising their calculations. Ethan stood at the table in the old gray suit, and the room was full of the sound of people recalibrating. And outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seattle was doing what Seattle does in October. The light flat and gray, the city looking steady and indifferent to the crisis occurring 11 floors above it. He had about 10 minutes before the lawyers started arriving and the room became a different kind of chaos. He used them to stand still, which was harder than it sounds. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. He didn't look at it until later. It was a message from Nora Lamb, sent from the 11th floor at the moment the security call had gone out through the building's internal system. Because of course she had been monitoring the internal alerts. Of course she had. Because she had been waiting and watching the same way he had. And because the thing he had told her 2 weeks ago at the coffee station had asked her to be patient, not passive. The message said, "I'm sending the 17 documents to the board now, all of them. I've been waiting for the right moment." He read it and put his phone back in his pocket. There it was. He hadn't been wrong about her. Victoria Hale was still standing at the head of the table, and she was looking at him with something in her face that he could not fully name. Fury underneath, something else on top of it, a quality of assessment that even now, even in this moment, was running the calculations. She was not a person who stopped running the calculations. He had known that when he hired her, and it remained true. "You can't undo what we've built," she said, low, just the two of them cutting through the noise of the room. "I'm not trying to undo what you built," he said. "I'm trying to preserve what I built. There's a difference." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then she looked away. The lawyers arrived at 9 minutes and 40 seconds. The lawyers arriving did not make things calmer. That was the first thing Ethan had to adjust to. The naive assumption he'd held, somewhere underneath his planning, that once the documents were on the table and the override was invoked, the situation would resolve into something orderly. It did not. What it resolved into was noise. 3 lawyers came in within the first 15 minutes. 2 were Luminos's internal counsel, a man and a woman whose names Ethan didn't know, who went immediately to Victoria's end of the table and began a rapid, low-voiced conversation that involved a lot of page-turning in the documents he'd laid out. The third was from an outside firm. Gerald Foss had him on the phone within minutes of the invocation, and he arrived 22 minutes later in a suit that cost more than Ethan's monthly rent, breathing slightly harder than a man his age should be after a fast elevator ride. Raymond Price had left the room within 5 minutes of the invocation, escorted by no one, just standing up quietly and walking out in the manner of a person who has decided that absence from a scene is preferable to presence in it. Ethan noted it and let it go. Raymond would be dealt with through the proper mechanisms, and the proper mechanisms were now in motion. The Meridian representatives had also left, in the particular way that private equity people leave situations that have become legally complicated, smoothly, without drama, with the air of people who have many other meetings, and this one has simply become less relevant. The thin man who'd asked about the override clause paused in the doorway for just a moment and looked back at Ethan with an expression that was not hostile, just appraising. The look of a professional encountering a variable they had not factored. What remained in the room was this: Victoria Hale, her 2 lawyers, Gerald Foss and his 1 lawyer, Douglas Chen, who had not moved from his seat, 2 security officers who were visibly uncertain about what their role was now, and Ethan Carter standing at the side of the table in a gray suit, waiting. Grace Tan arrived at 11:15. She had driven from Portland at 6 in the morning, which Ethan had asked her to do 2 days prior without explaining the specific reason. And she walked in looking composed and carrying a bag that contained, he knew, enough documentation to sustain the invocation against any immediate legal challenge. She looked at the room. She looked at Ethan. "Well," she said, setting her bag on the table, "let's begin." The verification process took 4 hours. They were 4 hours that Ethan spent mostly sitting in a chair against the wall while lawyers talked to each other, which was less dramatic than what had preceded them, but in its own way more exhausting. The sustained tension of waiting while other people handled the machinery of what you'd set in motion. Grace was steady and methodical. The opposing lawyers were good, and they pushed on every point they could push on, and Grace held each point with the particular composure of a person who has done their preparation and knows it. The founder override clause was valid. The documentation was airtight. The invocation had been correctly executed. At 3:17 in the afternoon, the last challenge was withdrawn. Victoria Hale's authority as CEO was suspended. Gerald Foss's board position was frozen pending investigation. A temporary authority structure was to be administered by Ethan, under oversight of the remaining board members who were not implicated in the documents, while a full legal and financial review was conducted. Victoria stood at the head of the table during the final confirmation, and she was composed in the way that certain people are composed, not through calm exactly, but through a decision to maintain composure as a form of resistance. She had stopped arguing an hour earlier, which he'd been watching for, because the moment she stopped arguing was the moment she accepted the outcome, even if she wasn't going to say so. When the security officers were told finally, clearly, what their assignment was, they looked at Victoria. She looked back at them for one moment. Then she picked up her phone from the table and her jacket from the chair, and she walked out of the room ahead of them, not escorted so much as preceding them, maintaining the posture of a person who leaves on their own terms even when they don't. The door closed. Douglas Chen let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding for some portion of the last 4 hours. "That," he said to no one in particular, "was the longest Monday of my life." What followed was not a clean restoration. Ethan had known it wouldn't be, but the reality of it was still harder than the knowing. By Tuesday morning, the news had moved through the building in the way news moves through buildings. Imperfectly, fast, in fragments that were partly accurate and partly distorted by the specific anxieties of whoever was passing them along. What people understood was that something had happened on 22, that the CEO was gone, that the company was under some kind of temporary authority, and that nobody knew exactly what it meant for them. That uncertainty was its own kind of damage, and it spread quickly. Ethan was in a conference room on 22 when the market opened Tuesday morning. He watched the stock price with Douglas and Grace, and 2 remaining board members who had flown in overnight. A woman named Helen Park, who had been on the board since Luminosa's 2nd year and who Ethan trusted, and a man named Thomas Greer who was newer and whom Ethan was still assessing. The stock had opened down 11% on the news of the executive suspension, driven by the specific panic that financial markets have when leadership structures become suddenly unclear. By noon, it was down 17. Helen Park said, "We need to make a public statement." "I know," Ethan said. "The longer we wait, the worse this gets. Markets don't like uncertainty. They especially don't like uncertainty about a company this size." "I understand that." "Then what are we waiting for?" He looked at her. Helen was in her 50s, angular, direct in the way of a person who had spent decades in boardrooms and had stopped softening her language somewhere around year 15. He had always respected her, even when they disagreed. "I'm waiting for the auditors to confirm the financial picture," he said. "If I make a statement before we know the full scope of what was done to this company's books, I'm going to have to revise the statement, and revising the statement will be worse than waiting." Helen was quiet for a moment. "How long?" "Stuart Okafor's team is already in the building. He says 48 hours for the initial picture." "The market won't like 48 hours." "No," he said. "It won't." She looked at him steadily. "You've been out of this company for 5 years, Ethan. Half the people in this building don't know who you are. The other half have heard your name, but couldn't tell you what you actually did here." "I know that." "So when you walk into a room full of people who are scared about their jobs and their company and ask them to trust a man they've never met, you need to understand what you're asking." I understand it," he said. Helen looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," she said, 48 hours. He called a full staff assembly for Wednesday morning. All available personnel, every floor, the main atrium, which was large enough to hold several hundred people, and which he'd never been in before, but which Douglas had described as the space the company used for all-hands events. He arrived early and stood in it alone for about 10 minutes, looking at the space. The Luminos logo on the back wall. The stage at the front where whoever had been running these meetings for the past 5 years had stood and told the company's story in whatever version served the current strategic direction. He was not good at speeches. He had never been good at speeches. Daniel had been better at them. Daniel could make a room feel like a conversation, could make 400 people feel like they were being talked to individually. Ethan had always been more comfortable in small rooms with specific problems. But small rooms were not what this moment required. People filed in at 8 o'clock and the atrium filled in the way atriums fill. Incompletely, clusters forming, people standing with the colleagues they knew best. An ambient low-level anxiety producing the specific quality of noise that a crowd makes when it's waiting for something it's uncertain about. He saw Nora Lamb arrive and find a position near the left side, standing straight, watching the stage. He saw Douglas near the back. He did not see anyone from the executive tier, because the executive tier had largely emptied. He walked onto the stage. The noise didn't exactly stop. It lowered, graduated, became a sort of waiting silence. He stood at the microphone and looked out at the room. Several hundred people. Some of their faces were familiar from his weeks on the 7th floor. Most were not. All of them were waiting to find out what the next hour meant for their lives. "My name is Ethan Carter," he said. "I founded this company 11 years ago. I left 5 years ago, and I should have been paying more attention while I was gone. I wasn't, and that's on me." The silence had a different quality now. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you everything is fine. It's not fine. There are some real problems with what was done to this company's finances and its research assets. And sorting through those problems is going to take time, and it's going to be uncomfortable. The stock is down. The press is going to be unpleasant for a while. Some things we thought were stable are going to turn out to be less stable than we thought." He paused. A few people in the crowd were exchanging looks. Most were just watching him. "What I can tell you is what's true. Nobody who works here honestly is going to lose their job because of what happened on Monday. The company's operational capacity is intact. The technology works. The infrastructure works. What was being dismantled was the research division and the long-term future of this company, and that dismantling has stopped." He looked around the room. "I know some of you have been watching pieces of this company disappear for 2 years. I know some of you have been trying to figure out why things were changing in ways that didn't make sense. And I know some of you made a decision to keep that knowledge to yourselves because you didn't know who to trust with it." His eyes found Nora for a moment. She was very still. "That's going to change," he said, "starting now." The room was quiet. Not the waiting for something quiet from before, but a different kind. The silence of people who have been holding their breath for a long time and are trying to decide whether it's safe to let it out. A man near the front, young, maybe 25, with the look of someone who has decided he has nothing left to lose by asking, raised his hand. "What about our pensions? The restructuring froze the contribution matching 8 months ago, and we never got an explanation." Ethan looked at him. "That gets reversed. This week." Another voice from the middle of the crowd. "The research team on 12, are those programs coming back?" "I can't promise you a specific timeline. What I can promise is that nobody is defunding the research division again while I'm here." A woman near the back called out, "How long are you planning to be here?" The question hung in the air with a particular weight because it was the question underneath all the other questions. The one that everyone in the room was actually asking. Is this real? Is this permanent? Is this a person we can believe? Or is this the next version of something that will change again in ways we can't predict or control? He didn't have a clean answer to it. He knew that. "I don't know the exact shape of what happens next," he said. "I'd be lying if I gave you a confident plan right now, because we're still figuring out the full scope of the damage. What I know is that I'm not leaving again until this is stable. And I know what this company was built to do, because I built it. Those two things are the foundation." He stopped. "It's not much. I understand that. But it's what I have." The room sat with that for a moment. Douglas Chen from the back said in a voice that carried well, "It's more than we had Monday morning." There was a sound in the room then. Not quite laughter, not quite agreement, but something between the two, the specific release of a group of people who have been in sustained tension, finding a small shared moment of something lighter. It wasn't a triumph. It wasn't a turning point. It was just people breathing. Austin. The 48 hours of auditing became 72, which Ethan had half expected. Stuart Okafor's team worked through Wednesday night and into Thursday, and Stuart himself came to Ethan's temporary office on the 22nd floor at 9 on Thursday morning and set a thick printout on the desk with the expression of someone who has found what they expected but is still troubled by the finding of it. "It's thorough," Stuart said. "Whoever was managing the books was good. The accounts are technically clean. There's nothing that rises to obvious fraud on the surface. But the pattern of decisions, the timing, the equity positions that Victoria and Price hold in a holding company that is, as of 8 months ago, a disclosed partner of Meridian Capital." He stopped. "The SEC is going to have questions." "They already have questions," Grace said from the chair beside the desk. "We filed the initial notification this morning." Stuart nodded. The research division's IP valuation, before the defunding, was somewhere between $8 and $12 billion on its own. The storage technology program specifically. That's now been dispersed to a point where it would take 12 to 18 months to reconstitute the team and the research infrastructure, even if you started today. Ethan was quiet. "The company is still worth $42 billion with those assets intact or reconstituted," Stuart continued. "Meridian was getting it for 11.4. The people in that room on Monday were going to split a transaction fee structure that would have netted Victoria Hale approximately $300 million, Price around $180, and Foss, through the holding company arrangement, close to $400 million. The numbers sat in the room. "The employees," Ethan said, "the stock option plans for employees below the senior level, those were not part of the transaction structure. Standard employees' positions would have been absorbed at current market value, which is significantly below actual value. Most of them would have seen their options diluted by 40 to 60% without understanding why." Ethan stood up and walked to the window. Seattle was doing its usual thing. Down below, the street was ordinary. People and cars and the indifferent motion of a city that didn't know and mostly didn't care what was happening 11 floors above it. He thought about the young man at the All Hands who had asked about pension contributions. He thought about Douglas Chen's compressed frustration. He thought about Nora Lamb carrying her stack of papers to a borrowed conference room because the research division had run out of space. He said, without turning from the window, "What do we need to start the reconstitution process for the research team?" Stuart said, "Money and time, and someone who knows what the program was supposed to become. I know what it was supposed to become, Ethan said. Daniel and I designed the second-generation storage architecture in year 4. I still have the original specifications. There was a silence behind him. Grace said carefully, "The legal process is going to run parallel to the operational recovery. The SEC investigation, the civil suits, those will take years. You'll need to be functional as a company while that machinery runs." I know. The board needs to ratify a proper authority structure. You can't run a company of this size under an emergency founder clause indefinitely. I know that too. So what do you want to do? He turned back from the window. Stuart and Grace were looking at him across the desk. Two people who were good at their jobs, who had shown up when he'd needed them, and who were now waiting for him to tell them what came next. "Call the remaining board members," he said. "All of them. I want a proper session by end of week." He looked at Grace. "And I need the communications team, whoever runs it now, whoever's left after the last 2 days, in here this afternoon. The market needs a statement, and so do the employees, and we're not going to get those right by being vague." Grace nodded and picked up her phone. Stuart gathered his printout and stood. At the door, he paused. "For whatever it's worth," he said, "I've done forensic work on a lot of companies in trouble. Most of the time, when something like this happens, the core product is damaged too. The technology, the actual thing the company is supposed to do. I spent 3 days in the systems documentation with your engineering team." He paused. "The technology is intact. Everything those people built, the engineers, the research team, it's still there. Whatever was being done to this company, they couldn't quite get to the core of it." He left. Ethan sat back down at the desk. He looked at the printout Stuart had left. He looked at the window. He was tired. Not the theatrical tiredness of a person who wants acknowledgement for their effort, but the plain exhaustion of someone who has been running on sustained focus for 3 weeks and is now, in a brief quiet moment, feeling the weight of it all at once. His back hurt from the bad chair in the temporary office. He had a headache that had been present since Monday, and that he kept ignoring. He had called Sophie every evening and told her he was okay and that things were going forward, and she had listened carefully and said okay in the tone she used when she was accepting information while reserving judgment on it. He needed to do better on that front. He knew it. He was adding it to the list. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. It was a message from a number he didn't recognize, which resolved, when he read it, into a name he did. "This is Marcus Webb. I heard what happened Monday. I've been wanting to say something for a year and a half. Call me when you can." Ethan stared at the message for a long moment. Then he set the phone face down on the desk and looked at the ceiling for 10 seconds. Just 10 seconds of not thinking about anything specific, of letting the room be quiet around him. Then he picked the phone back up and called Marcus Webb. Nora Lamb came to his office Thursday afternoon without an appointment, which was easy to do because there was no real gatekeeping structure on 22 anymore, and the administrative assistant who had managed Victoria's schedule had resigned Tuesday morning. She knocked on the open door. He looked up. "I wanted to explain the timing," she said. He gestured to the chair across the desk. She sat down, still carrying the particular quality of tension she'd had since the first day in the lobby, though it was different now. Not the suppressed weight of someone carrying a secret, but the residual tightness of a person who has done a frightening thing and is still absorbing the fact that they did it. "I found the documents 8 months ago," she said. "The subdirectory. I knew what they were. I sat on them for 6 months because I didn't know what to do with them, and because every time I thought about doing something, I thought about what would happen to me if I was wrong, or if I was right, but nobody believed it, or if I was right, and someone decided to make my life very difficult for knowing it." "That's a reasonable calculation," Ethan said. She looked slightly surprised that he said it. "I eventually sent the email," she said, "to an address I found in a very old archive file, a personal contact associated with the original founder registration documentation. I wasn't sure it was still active." He was quiet. "I didn't know what would happen," she said. "I sent it at 2 in the morning after 3 glasses of wine, and then I couldn't sleep at all, and by morning I was convinced I'd made a terrible mistake." "You didn't make a terrible mistake," he said. "I know that now." She paused. "I didn't know it for a long time." She looked at her hands. "When you started here, I recognized something. Not you. I didn't know who you were. But I recognized the way you looked at the building, like someone who was seeing the distance between what something is and what it should be. What gave it away? The legacy documents, she said, and then the gap analysis, and then the way you talked about the architectures, like you'd been thinking about it for years and were seeing it again after an absence. She looked up at him. I figured it out around day 10. I didn't say anything because I thought if I did, I might spook you. Ethan almost laughed. You were protecting my cover. I was protecting the outcome, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her. She was 26 years old and she had sent an email at 2 a.m, 3 glasses of wine deep, and then spent 8 months living with the weight of what she knew. And she had waited and calculated and timed the release of those 17 documents to the precise moment when they would do the most good. She had done it alone, in a company that had been giving her less space and fewer resources every quarter, in a building full of people who had mostly adapted to the new order rather than resisting it. What do you want? He said. She blinked. It was apparently not the question she'd expected. What do you mean? From here. From what comes next. You took a significant risk and it worked out, and now there's a different kind of company than there was last week. What do you want your place in it to be? She was quiet for a moment. I want the storage research program back, she said. The second generation work. I was on that team before the restructuring. I know the research, I know where we were and where we were going. You'd lead it? I'd need people. We lost most of the team. We'll find them, he said. Some of them went to competitors. We'll have conversations. He paused. You'd be directing a significant research program. You're 26. I know. I'm not saying no. I'm saying it comes with scrutiny and pressure and a board that's going to ask hard questions about the budget. I've been answering hard questions with no resources for 2 years, she said. I can answer them with resources. He nodded once. Get me a proposal. What the program needs, timeline, personnel, budget. Give me a draft by end of next week. She stood up. At the door, she paused. The same spot Stuart had paused that morning, which was maybe something about the architecture of the room, the way the threshold created a moment of hesitation. I'm sorry it took me 6 months to send the email, she said. It took me 5 years to come back, he said. You're ahead of me. She left. He sat alone in the office for a while. Outside the window, the Seattle afternoon was making its slow way toward evening. The stock had closed down 14% for the day. The press coverage was extensive and mostly unflattering, operating in the reductive way of press coverage about corporate crises, converting complicated realities into simple stories about winners and losers. His phone had 47 unread messages in it. He was going to have to start answering them. But for a few more minutes, he sat in the quiet of the office that used to belong to someone who had taken what he'd built and tried to sell it for parts, and he let the exhaustion and the strange grief and the complicated satisfaction of the past 3 weeks settle into their proper proportions. Then he picked up his phone, opened the message from Marcus Webb, and called back the man who knew this company almost as well as he did. There was a lot left to rebuild. Marcus Webb answered on the second ring, which told Ethan he'd been waiting for the call. His voice was older than Ethan remembered. Not dramatically so, but with the slight roughness that settles into a person who has been carrying something heavy for too long. He said Ethan's name the way people say the name of someone they thought they might not hear from again, with a particular quality of relief underneath the greeting. I watched it happen, Marcus said, once they were past the initial exchange. He was at his home in Bellevue, he said, had been there since the retirement. Not the specific details. I didn't know about the Meridian arrangement or the acquisition timeline, but I watched the company changing in ways I couldn't stop. Victoria was always 3 steps ahead of any objection I raised. By the time I understood what the pattern was, she had enough board alignment to override me on anything significant. Why didn't you call me? Ethan said. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Ethan thought the connection had dropped. Because you'd left, Marcus said finally. And the way you left, you needed to leave. You needed to go be Sophie's father, and you needed to stop running on grief, and calling you back into this would have undone all of that. A pause. And because I told myself I could fix it from inside. I kept believing that right up until I couldn't anymore. How did they get you out? Health concerns, Marcus said, and the dryness in his voice was unmistakable. I had a genuine cardiac event. Nothing serious, ultimately, a warning shot. Victoria used it very skillfully, suggested that the stress of the role was incompatible with recovery, had two board members echo the concern, made it feel like the responsible thing for me to do was step down. Another pause. I was in a hospital bed and she sat beside me and told me very gently that she would take care of everything. I believed her because I was scared and tired. That's the thing about very good manipulators. They find the moment when you're most human. Ethan listened to that. I should have tried harder to reach you, Marcus said. However wrong I thought it would be to pull you back, I should have tried. That's mine to carry. We're carrying it together, Ethan said. Are you healthy enough to consult? Not full-time, not the stress of daily operations, but I need someone who knows this company's board history, and I need someone I trust. The pause this time was shorter. Yes, Marcus said. Tell me what you need. Otiet. The board session happened on Friday, 2 days after the all-hands assembly, in a conference room on 22 that still smelled faintly of the previous week's crisis in the way that rooms absorb the emotional temperature of what happens in them. Helen Park chaired it. Thomas Greer sat to her right, still in the process of deciding, Ethan sensed, which way his alignment would finally settle. 2 additional board members had joined by video. A woman in London named Priya Soren, who had been a Luminos investor since year 3, and a man in Chicago named Carl Abbott, who ran a clean energy infrastructure fund and who had called Ethan's cell phone on Wednesday morning and said, without preamble, "What do you need and how fast do you need it?" The agenda was formal, documented, everything above board by design. Because one of the things Ethan had understood the moment he sat down in that temporary office was that the corrective process had to be as transparent as the corruption had been concealed. If he rebuilt Luminos in the shadows the way it had been dismantled in them, he would have fixed nothing except the personnel. The board ratified the emergency authority structure, then moved to establish a proper transitional governance framework. Ethan was named interim executive chairman, not CEO, deliberately, because he wanted a permanent CEO search to begin within 90 days, and he wanted the company to know that this was a transition and not a permanent installation of the founder's authority. Why not CEO? Thomas Greer asked, directly enough that Ethan appreciated it. You built the company. You have the technical expertise. Why the interim distinction? Because the last time Luminos needed a long-term CEO, the person who fit that description was not me, Ethan said. I'm a builder. I'm good at creating things, and I'm good at fixing things. Running a company of this scale through its second decade requires someone who is good at operating, at managing complexity over sustained time without burning out or losing perspective. That's not my best skill. Helen Park said, It's a reasonable self-assessment. It's an honest one, he said. Greer looked at him for a moment. All right, he said. I can work with that. The session ran 4 hours. By the end of it, the governance structure was established. The authority was legitimate, and the legal cooperation framework with the SEC investigation was formally approved. The civil suits against Victoria Hale, Raymond Price, and Gerald Foss were filed the following Monday by Grace Tan's team in conjunction with an outside litigation firm that specialized in corporate fraud cases. The SEC moved simultaneously. The process would take years. These things always did. But the machinery was running, and the documentation was solid enough that Grace told him, with the careful language of a lawyer who does not make promises, that she felt very good about the evidentiary position. Raymond Price's attorneys began cooperating with investigators within 3 weeks, which surprised no one who had observed him walking quietly out of that meeting room on Monday afternoon. Gerald Foss issued a public denial through his law firm that convinced no one, least of all the investigators, who had access to the documents in Subdirectory 14. Victoria Hale said nothing publicly, which was consistent with the advice of very good defense attorneys and also with the specific quality of her character. She had always been more comfortable with silence than with the alternative. The thing about rebuilding something is that it doesn't feel like the stories about rebuilding feel. There is no montage. There is no clean narrative arc of crisis followed by recovery, followed by triumph. What there is, mostly, is a series of individual days, each with its own problems, its own resistances, its own small defeats alongside whatever progress is being made. Ethan lived in a hotel in Seattle for the first 3 weeks. He told Sophie he would be home on weekends, which he managed for 2 out of 3 of them. The third weekend, a crisis in the operational systems kept him in the building on Saturday, and he called her at 7 in the evening feeling the weight of the broken promise even before he made it. "I can't come home tonight," he said. "Something came up with the systems, and I have to be here." Sophie was quiet on her end. He could hear the television in the background. Mrs. Chen was there, apparently. Saturday evening company. "Okay," Sophie said. "I'm sorry. I'll make it up to—" "Dad," she said, cutting him off with the precision of a 7-year-old who has decided that a certain kind of apology language is not what she needs. "I know you're busy. I know it's important. Just don't say you'll make it up to me, because that's not a thing you can actually do." He held the phone in the hotel stairwell where he'd stepped to make the call. "You're right," he said. "I just want you to come home when you can," she said. "Not to make up for when you couldn't." "Okay," he said. "I hear you." Also, Gerald ate my colored pencil. Gerald the bear ate a pencil? I was using him as an armrest, and I guess I left it there, and he— She stopped, reconsidered. "I dropped it, and it rolled under him, and I forgot." He sat down on a step in the stairwell, still in his work clothes at 7 on a Saturday evening, and laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere you weren't expecting it to come from. "I'll bring new pencils," he said. "Monday. The big ones, not the small stubby ones." Noted. He stayed on the phone with her for another 15 minutes, listening to her describe the architectural details of a fort she had constructed in the living room using chair cushions and what sounded like an inadvisable quantity of tape. He let the ordinary specific details of her life wash over him, and when he said goodnight and hung up, he sat in the stairwell alone for a moment and let himself feel all of it at once. The tiredness and the weight and the particular grief of being needed in too many places, and the love for his daughter that sat underneath all the rest of it, like bedrock, quiet and permanent, and entirely undiminished by distance. Then he stood up and went back into the building to fix the systems problem. Thud. By the end of the first month, the stock had recovered to within 6% of its pre-crisis value. The communications team, rebuilt around a deputy director named Amara, who had been there through the transition and who turned out to be extraordinarily good at her job, issued a series of targeted statements and briefings that walked the market through the governance changes and the legal proceedings with a transparency that was unusual enough to generate its own positive press. Analysts who had been skeptical revised their notes. A long piece in a technology publication ran the headline, "Luminos Energy's forgotten founder comes back to reclaim the mission." Ethan read the headline and thought, that's not quite right. Not reclaim. Something more complicated than that. Something closer to reckon with. Douglas Chen was appointed acting head of engineering operations, a role that formalized what he'd already been doing in practice. He accepted it with the understated relief of a man who has been waiting for the organization to catch up to the reality of what he was actually doing. He took Ethan to lunch on his first official day in the role, which involved a sandwich from a place 2 blocks from the building and a bench near the waterfront because Douglas said he needed air. "I knew," Douglas said, staring at the water. "Not who you were, but I knew something was wrong with the company for at least a year." "Why didn't you do anything?" "What would I have done? Gone to the CEO and said, 'I have a feeling something's off. I had a mortgage and 2 kids in school.'" He took a bite of his sandwich. "I'm not proud of it, but that's the truth." "I understand the truth," Ethan said. "Does that make it better?" "It makes it human," Ethan said. "There's a difference." Douglas chewed in silence for a moment. "The 4 engineers who left," he said. 2 of them called me this week. They'd heard what happened. They want to come back." "What did you tell them?" "I told them to call HR and that I'd put in a word." "Put in the word," Ethan said. Douglas nodded. He looked sideways at Ethan. "For what it's worth, and I know it's complicated, you did right by the people in that building. The all-hands thing, the way you talked to them." "I talked to them like they were adults who deserved the truth," Ethan said. "That's not a high bar." "In my experience," Douglas said, "you'd be surprised how high a bar it actually is." Nora Lamb's proposal came in at the end of the second week, 17 pages, detailed, technically precise, with a personnel reconstruction plan that had clearly been thought about for a long time. She wanted to rebuild the second-generation storage research team from 8 people to start, expanding to 20 over 18 months. She had already made informal contact with 3 of the dispersed team members who had expressed interest in returning. The budget she'd outlined was substantial, deliberately slightly high because she'd anticipated negotiation, and the timeline was aggressive, but not dishonestly so. Ethan read it once, and then read it again, and then called her. "You undercosted the infrastructure rebuild in Section 4, he said. "I know," she said, "by about 14%. I ran the number 3 times. "So why did you submit it low?" "Because I knew you'd read it closely, and I wanted to see if you caught it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's either very smart or very irritating." "Probably both," she said. "Does the program get funded?" "Revised proposal with the corrected infrastructure costs, submitted to the board by end of week." "Yes." The line was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the specific restraint of someone who has wanted something for a long time and is trying not to show how much, "Okay." "Nora," he said. "Yeah." "The storage technology program, the second generation work. Before the restructuring, how close were you?" She was quiet for longer this time. "We were close," she said. "Not finished, not even close to finished in the way that sounds. But the core theoretical architecture was solid. We'd solved the primary efficiency problem. The remaining challenges were engineering problems, not science problems. That's a different kind of hard, still hard, but different." "How different?" 2 years, maybe 3, with the right team and the right resources. Without the disruption of the last 2 years, we'd probably already be there." He let that sit. 2 years of research time lost because someone decided the company was worth more as a transaction than as a thing that was actually doing what it was built to do. "Get the revised proposal in by Friday," he said, "and get your team list to Douglas. He's already heard from 2 of your former colleagues." The lease on the Portland house ran through the end of the year. Ethan found an apartment in Seattle in the second month. A practical 2-bedroom in a building that had decent light and was walkable to good schools. Neither charming nor depressing, just functional. He drove to Portland on a Sunday in November with a rented truck and Sophie's bike and the accumulated material of their life there. And Sophie supervised the loading with the detailed managerial energy she brought to anything she considered important, directing the placement of boxes with the authority of someone who has thought hard about organizational systems. "Gerald goes on top," she said, about the box containing her stuffed animals. "Noted. And the box with my art stuff has to go last because I need to be able to get to it fast. Art emergency situations." "Dad," she said, in the tone she used for things she considered beneath acknowledgement. They drove to Seattle with Sophie in the passenger seat. Too young for the front, but she'd negotiated it on the grounds that the truck only had 2 seats and she was not riding with the boxes. She watched Portland recede in the side mirror with the thoughtful quiet she had sometimes. The quiet that meant she was processing something rather than avoiding it. After about 20 minutes, she said, "Is Portland going to be sad without us?" "Portland will manage," he said. "That's not really an answer." "No," he said. "It'll probably just be Portland, with different people living in that house." She considered this. "I liked that house." "I know you did. But I also like being wherever you are," she said, with the matter-of-fact simplicity of a child stating something that is simply true without attaching weight to the statement. "So." He kept his eyes on the road and said nothing for a moment because there was a thickness in his throat that had arrived without permission. "Yeah," he said finally. "So." The Seattle apartment took 3 days to feel like anything other than boxes stacked in rooms. And then it slowly became the specific version of home that a place becomes when people who belong together are living in it, not through decoration or deliberate effort, but through the accumulation of ordinary things. Sophie's drawings on the refrigerator, the particular way the morning light came through the kitchen window, the sound of her talking to Gerald at night, the low monologue of a child explaining her day to an inanimate audience. Ethan started going to work at normal hours. Not because there was less to do, there was always more to do, but because he'd made a decision in that stairwell on the Saturday he'd missed coming home. A decision that was less dramatic than it sounds, and harder to maintain than any decision he'd made in the Luminos conference rooms. He would be present in his life. He would do the work, and then he would go home. And being home would not be the residual space left over from work, but a thing he protected. He was not always successful at it. There were evenings when he was still on the phone at 9, evenings when his mind was in the building even when his body was at the kitchen table. There were mornings when Sophie asked him something at breakfast, and he answered a beat too slowly because he'd been running through a problem in his head. He caught himself doing it, tried to do it less, caught himself again. It was imperfect. It was also the life he was actually living, rather than the one he was perpetually planning to live properly once things settled down. Things would never fully settle down. He understood that now in a way he hadn't at 24 or at 32, that the idea of a future state in which everything was stable and you could finally begin to be present was a story people told themselves to justify the distance they kept from their own lives. Sophie helped in ways she didn't know she was helping. Children are corrective forces. They bring everything back to the immediate and the specific. One evening in December, he came home from a board session with the accumulated weight of 3 separate problems that needed solutions by Friday, and Sophie met him at the door and said, "I made a list of all the states and their capitals today, and I got 37 of them right without looking." "That's impressive," he said, and he meant it. And for the next 15 minutes, while she recited the ones she still needed to learn, the 3 problems were still there, but they were in their proper proportion, real and requiring attention, but not the whole of everything. The months moved forward with the texture of real things rather than resolved things. Progress was genuine but uneven. The stock fully recovered by February and moved ahead of its pre-crisis value by March, carried partly by the announcements about the research program's restoration and partly by the market's tendency to reward narrative. And the narrative of a founder returning to reclaim a company's mission was, whatever its complications, a narrative that investors responded to. The legal proceedings churned along. Victoria Hale's defense team was good and would delay everything they could delay, which is the proper function of a defense team, and the full resolution of the civil and regulatory cases would take years. Raymond Price's cooperation agreement with investigators had produced significant additional documentation that Ethan was not privy to in detail, but which Grace described as very helpful to our position. Gerald Foss had quietly agreed to a consent decree with the SEC that involved substantial financial penalties and a permanent bar from serving as a director of any publicly traded company. He made no public statement. Ethan found, to his own surprise, that he thought about Victoria Hale less as time went on rather than more. In the early weeks, he'd expected a sustained anger, a constant reckoning with the specific betrayal of a person he'd trusted with something he'd built. What he found instead was something more complicated and less satisfying than anger. He thought about the way she'd sat in that meeting room after the invocation, calculating even in defeat. He thought about Marcus Webb in a hospital bed being told the responsible thing was to step back. He thought about all the small decisions, his and other people's, that had made the space for what happened. Betrayal rarely arrives fully formed. It's built incrementally, in the gaps left by the people who were supposed to be paying attention. Ethan had left a gap for 5 years, and Victoria Hale had been very precise about what she put in it. That didn't make what she'd done any less wrong, but it also didn't let him off clean, and he knew it, and he didn't try to argue himself out of knowing it. He had a conversation with Nora about it, unexpectedly, in March. She came to his office to review the first quarter of the research program's reconstitution, and they ended up talking for 2 hours, ranging beyond the research numbers into the larger questions that the past months had generated for both of them. "Do you ever think about what she was actually trying to do?" Nora said. "Not the corruption part. The vision. The 340% revenue growth was real. The market expansion was real." "It was real," he said. "She built a very successful company. She just built it on top of what you'd actually created, removed the parts she thought were inefficient, and then tried to sell it before the removal became visible. Which describes a lot of what passes for strategic leadership," he said. Nora was quiet for a moment. "Is that too harsh?" "Probably not harsh enough, honestly." He leaned back. The problem isn't efficiency. Efficiency is fine. The problem is when you optimize for what can be measured right now at the expense of what can only be understood over time. Research is like that. It looks inefficient because you can't value a breakthrough before it happens. You can only value it after. And by then, the person who cut the research budget is long gone with their transaction fees. She didn't believe in the long game, Nora said. Or she believed in a different long game, he said. One that started with her and ended with her. Nora turned her coffee cup in her hands, thinking, do you think she ever believed in what Luminos was supposed to be? In the beginning? It was a question he'd sat with himself, without resolution. I think she believed in it the way you believe in a story about yourself, he said. You hire someone because the story of who they are matches the story you're telling about the company. For a while, the stories align. Then they don't, and you find out which story was actually running the decisions. That's a little bleak, Nora said. It's also how you avoid making the same mistake twice, he said. You stop hiring people for the story they tell and start watching for what they do when no one's constructing a narrative around it. Nora considered that. Is that what you were doing? In the lobby with the old suit for 2 weeks? Partly, he said. I was also watching what you did when no one was paying attention. She smiled for the first time in the conversation, a small, real smile. I went to get coffee and talked to a stranger. You'd been carrying 17 documents for 8 months, and you chose to give them to someone you'd known for 11 days based entirely on the way he asked to see old records, he said. That's not nothing. No, she said. I suppose it isn't. Cut. The CEO search concluded in April. The person they selected was a woman named Diane Forsyth, 51, who had spent 20 years running operational divisions at large infrastructure companies and who had a reputation for exactly the kind of sustained complexity-managing leadership that Ethan had described needing and not being. She was not flashy. She did not have the particular electric quality that people sometimes mistake for leadership, and which is often just charisma untethered from judgment. She asked precise questions, listened carefully to the answers, and had a habit of circling back to things said in earlier conversations to test whether her understanding of them had been correct. Ethan liked her immediately and told Helen Park so. Helen said, "She reminds me of the opposite of the last CEO." That's partly why, he said. Diane Forsyth walked through the building on her first day in a way that reminded Ethan of himself in the lobby 6 months earlier, absorbing, observing, noting the distance between what she saw and what she was going to need to understand. She came to Ethan's office at 4 in the afternoon and sat across from him and said, "Tell me the 3 things you most need me to know that aren't in any of the briefing documents." He thought about it genuinely. First, the research division is the company, not the revenue, not the market expansion, not the infrastructure deployment. Those are important, but they're derivative. The research is the thing everything else grows from. Don't let anyone argue you out of that. Second, Douglas Chen and Nora Lam are the 2 most essential people in this building. Protect them from the organizational friction that tries to manage people who are actually building things. Third, he paused. Third is more personal than professional. This company has had a lot of people in it over the years who cared genuinely about what it was doing. They've been through a hard period. They need leadership that tells them the truth, even when the truth is complicated. They can handle complicated. They can't handle being managed. Diane looked at him for a moment. The second one is more personal than professional too, she said. Yes, he said. It is. She nodded. Okay. She stood up. I'll be in the building by 7 tomorrow. You don't need to be. He blinked. Excuse me? You've been here since October, she said. I'm the CEO now. You're the executive chairman. Those are different jobs, and you're still doing mine as well as yours. She said it without hostility, just cleanly, the way she said most things. I'll need you, and I'll ask when I do. But I also need room to actually run this company, rather than run it in the shadow of your version of running it. That's not a criticism. It's just operational reality. He held her gaze. You've been on the job for 4 hours, he said. Yes, she said, which is exactly long enough to see it clearly. He almost argued, then he didn't. All right, he said. She left his office and he sat there for a while, in the chair behind the desk that had been Victoria Hale's and was now his temporarily and would be nobody's specifics soon. And he thought about what it felt like to be correctly managed by someone you just hired. It felt, he decided, like something was working the way it was supposed to. He was in the building less after Diane arrived, which was the design. He went home at actual evening hours. He attended board meetings and the specific things that required him. He had a standing conversation with Diane on Friday mornings that ran 45 minutes, no more, in which she told him what he needed to know, and he told her what he thought she should hear, and both of them told the truth. On a Tuesday in May, almost exactly 7 months after the email had arrived at 2 in the morning, Ethan sat in his office in the early afternoon and found himself with an hour that had no specific demand on it. This had not happened since October, and it was disorienting in the specific way of a person who has been moving at sustained speed and is suddenly asked to stop. His first instinct was to fill it, to pull up a document, to make a call, to find the next thing that needed doing. He did none of those things. He turned his chair to face the window. Seattle was doing what Seattle does in May. The particular tentative warmth of a Pacific Northwest spring, the light coming in at a lower angle than it would later in the year, the city looking almost gentle in it. He watched it for a while. He thought about Daniel. He did this sometimes, not with the specific targeted grief of the early years, but in the quieter way that you think about someone who is gone, but whose absence has become one of the dimensions of your life rather than an interruption to it. He thought about what Daniel would have made of the past 7 months. The irony that the founder override clause, Daniel's half-joking, entirely deliberate insurance policy, had been the precise instrument that made everything possible. He thought about the second-generation storage work and what it would have meant to Daniel to see Nora's team working on it, to see the research program alive again. He thought, I'm sorry I left it for 5 years, and I know you'd understand why. And I hope whatever this is now is something like what we meant it to be. He wasn't sure those were the right thoughts, exactly. They were the true ones, which was sufficient. His phone buzzed. Sophie, 3:30, which meant school had just let out. He picked up. I got chosen for the science project showcase, she said, before he could say hello. That's excellent. I know. It's the bridge thing, the suspension bridge. He smiled. The cable shape? Distributing the load, she said, with the satisfied confidence of someone deploying knowledge they understand. Ms. Patterson said it was the most technically detailed project in the class. What does that mean for the showcase? I present in front of the whole school in 2 weeks, she said. You have to come. I will be there, he said. Put it in my calendar. I already emailed your assistant, she said. He was quiet for a moment. You emailed my assistant? I found the address on the company website, she said, completely unapologetic. She said she'd block it out. He stopped. That's very organized of you. I learned from watching you, she said, and he couldn't tell if it was a compliment or an observation, which was in itself very Sophie. He stayed on the phone with her as she walked home, listening to her account of the day, a dispute about the rules of a different game, a substitute teacher who hadn't known what to do with her questions about structural engineering, a lunch situation involving someone else's sandwich that had been resolved to her satisfaction. The ordinary, specific, irreplaceable texture of her life, filling his ear as he sat in the glass tower that bore his name and its history. When she got home, she said goodbye and hung up with the dispatch of a child who has accomplished the things she called to accomplish. He held the phone for a moment after the call ended, looking at the window and the May afternoon beyond it. This was the thing that took him the longest to understand. Not the corporate mechanics, not the legal architecture, not even the human betrayal of people he'd trusted. Those were hard, but they were the kind of hard that a person with enough stubbornness and resources can work through. The thing that was genuinely difficult to understand, and that he was still only beginning to understand, was simpler and more personal than any of that. He had spent 11 years building something that mattered in the world, and in doing so, he had developed a particular story about where meaning lived, in the company, in the technology, in the mission, in the work itself. When Daniel died and the work lost its animating force, he had stepped back, but he'd still located himself in relation to the company even in his absence from it. The grief of leaving had been real in part because he'd understood himself so completely through Luminos that removing himself from it felt like removing himself from a definition. And then Sophie had become his entirely, and she'd required something he hadn't known how to give, not provision or protection, which he'd managed, but presence. The particular kind of attention that a child needs that cannot be subdivided or scheduled or made more efficient. The kind of attention that is only available when you are not in some interior room somewhere else. He was still learning how to give it. He was getting better. He was also, still, imperfect at it in ways that Sophie had started to name clearly enough that he couldn't ignore them, which was probably the most useful feedback he'd ever received from any source. The thing he'd come to understand, slowly, reluctantly, through the texture of actual experience rather than through any clean epiphany, was that the question of what to protect was not a question about companies or missions or legacies. It was a question about what you were willing to be fully present for, what you were willing to let matter enough to be frightening. He had walked into that building in October in an old suit and no plan except to see clearly. He had seen clearly. He had done what needed doing, and it had cost him in ways that were real. Exhaustion and uncertainty and the mortgage of attention that every significant thing requires. He did not regret it. The company was alive and honest, and doing the work it was built to do, and somewhere on the 11th floor a 26-year-old researcher was rebuilding a program that Daniel had theorized 20 years ago, and that mattered, genuinely, in the way that very few things genuinely matter. But Sophie had been right, in the stairwell conversation he still thought about. You couldn't make up for being absent by being present later. You could only be present now and keep being present, and understand that the ordinary evenings and the bridge projects and the phone calls at 3:30 and the conversation about pencils named Gerald was not the residual space left over from the important things. It was the important thing. It had always been the important thing. He had just taken a very long way around to understanding it. The science showcase was on a Thursday evening in the second week of May. Ethan arrived early because Sophie had specified that he arrive early, and he sat in a folding chair in the school gymnasium, surrounded by the specific organized chaos of 100 children's projects and a gymnasium full of parents who had also been told to arrive early. Sophie's project was near the center of the room, a suspension bridge model made of string and balsa wood and what appeared to be a heroic quantity of the large colored pencils he'd brought back from Seattle. The bridge was about 3 feet long and improbably sturdy-looking, with carefully labeled components in her neat, slightly oversized handwriting. A small placard next to it read, "Why Bridges Bend, a Study in Load Distribution." He stood looking at it for a moment before she noticed him. When she did, she crossed the gymnasium at the speed she moved when she was trying to look like she wasn't hurrying, which was basically the speed of hurrying. She stopped in front of him. "You came early," she said. "You told me to come early." "I know." She looked at the project, then back at him. "What do you think?" "I think it's the best suspension bridge in this gymnasium," he said. "It's the only suspension bridge in this gymnasium," she said. "That doesn't change my assessment." She almost smiled, then controlled it with the seriousness of a person who has a presentation to give shortly and is maintaining their professional composure. Ms. Patterson said to explain the engineering first and then let people ask questions. "That's a good structure." "I know." "Sophie." She looked at him. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Not of the bridge specifically, though it's excellent. Just of you." She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her expression did the thing it sometimes did, the thing where the 7-year-old surface gave way briefly to something that was more like the person she was going to become. "I know," she said, and then, "I'm glad you came back." He wasn't sure if she meant tonight or something larger. With Sophie, the two were often the same. "Me too," he said. Across the gymnasium, a teacher was calling for the presentations to begin. Sophie straightened up, turned toward her project, and became for the next 20 minutes absolutely herself, precise and earnest and slightly impatient with questions she thought were missing the point, explaining the curve of a cable to a room full of adults who mostly hadn't thought carefully about suspension bridges before, radiating the specific energy of a person who knows something real about something and is glad to have the audience for it. Ethan sat in his folding chair and watched her and thought, this is what you protect when you have the courage to protect it. Not the empire, not the legacy, not the name on the building or the logo on the wall. This, the girl at the front of the room who knew why bridges bend, who had grown up watching her father be imperfect and stubborn and occasionally absent and always, eventually, present, who had learned from him, she said, and who was already teaching him things he hadn't known to look for. Outside the school gymnasium, Seattle was settling into its evening. Inside, a 7-year-old was explaining load distribution to people who needed to understand it. And Ethan Carter, founder of Luminos Energy, single father, man who had once slept on a cot above a Vietnamese restaurant because he believed he was building something worth building. Ethan sat in his chair and did not think about the company or the legal proceedings or the stock price or any of it. He was just there. That was enough. That had always been enough. He was only now getting good at believing it.